Okay, so I think we are ready to get started. Hopefully there aren't any audio issues. Could someone from the RTA please let me know if there are? So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Devlin. I'm a senior planner at the RTA. Welcome to the first of 4 RTA Transportation Tuesday webinars. Hopefully everyone has made it back to their computers after seeing the Blue Angels fly over. Definitely not something that you see every day. As some of you might be aware, the RTA has typically hosted an annual planning workshop, but given the current restrictions presented by the pandemic, we instead offer weekly webinars. We'd of course love to be able to have this dialogue in person and under different circumstances, but nonetheless, we appreciate your interest in learning more about active transportation's role in creating vibrant and active communities. The RTA has long felt that investing in active transportation is important to the region's public transportation network, and I'm happy to speak with the Active Transportation Alliance and Antero Group to hear about their impact. Before we get started, a few logistical notes. I did set everyone to mute, but if you can just confirm that you are on mute and that your camera is off to prevent any further distractions to anyone else participating. On the far right, you should be able to enable your chat box. That is where you'll be able to submit questions. Feel free to submit questions at any point during the webinar. We'll work to answer those as best we can towards the end of the presentation. Finally, this is being recorded and it will be made available, as well as the future Transportation Tuesday webinars will be made available on the RTA's website after the event. As mentioned, this is the first of 4 weekly series that the RTA is hosting. Next week, RTA's Michael Horstein will lead a discussion with other industry experts on how the right mix of municipal zoning principles enables development that aligns with the community's vision. Industry experts will provide insight to various zoning strategies that facilitate transit-oriented development and how those strategies benefit municipal goals. On June 2nd, the RTA Mobility Pilots webinar will highlight mobility pilots throughout the region with presentations specific to current and future pilots, planning studies, and coordinating partnerships. RTA staff, along with industry experts and municipal leaders, will present lessons learned. And on June 19th, we'll discuss the changing mobility environment by detailing current regional demographic trends, along with a panel discussion focused on how transportation and transit will evolve in meeting future needs. Panel questions and discussion will provide perspective on topics including connected and automated vehicles, shared use mobility, electrification, shifts in telework, aging population, and spatial mismatch. But for today, I'm joined by 2 presenters who work to make the Chicago region a more accessible place to live and work every day. First, Maggie Malin. Maggie is an advocacy manager at the Active Transportation Alliance. She leads the Chicagoland Complete Streets Coalition and the Bike Walk Every Town Alliance Suburban Advocacy Program. Curtis Witek is a senior project manager at Antero Group. Curtis has been a planner and a project manager with Antero Group since 2017 and leads the projects team on the Bedford Park Last Mile Mobility Study and Connect to Work Mobility Pilot. Curtis will also be joining us in June as a part of Mobility Pilot's discussion. So again, thank you both for joining us. In general, we hope you walk away from today's webinar with a better understanding of the active transportation programs available in the region, as well as how to manage project delivery. So during this webinar, I'll start by providing a high-level overview of the benefits of active transportation and the RTA programs available. Maggie will then be outlining Active Transportation Alliance's state and local advocacy and what to consider from the Illinois Transportation Enhancement Program. Curtis will then provide the perspective of a planner and project manager of active transportation projects and what to consider when developing a plan and implementation efforts. Finally, towards the end of the presentation, we'll open to Q&A. During the Q&A, feel free to approach us about any active transportation related question. It definitely doesn't need to stick to only the topics we put forward during the webinar. Between myself, Maggie, and Curtis, I'm sure we'd be able to point you in the right direction for your answer. So to start, I think it might be nice to remind ourselves what active transportation is. Generally, it's pretty self-explanatory, but active transportation refers to any non-motorized transportation, such as people walking, biking, or using mobility assist devices such as wheelchairs. Recently, planners have started to include certain types of micromobility, such as e-scooters, near this category. Although e-scooters are motorized, they are still considered vulnerable road users and are often presented with a lot of the same barriers as cyclists. So they're definitely a type of transportation to consider when planning for active transportation. So there are many different benefits of active transportation and investing in active transportation, but I thought I might wanted to highlight 4 of the most commonly mentioned. These are really great starting places when developing an argument in favor of expanding your community's active transportation network. Of the 4 benefits listed, I'll spend most of my time discussing the impact active transportation has on transit accessibility, which in itself impacts equity, the environment, and public health. So the first benefit I wanted to mention is the investment in public health and safety. Trails, bike lanes, and sidewalks connections can encourage exercising through recreation, and if aligned with nearby public transportation, can build light physical activity into a daily routine or commute of your community. So research, as we've probably heard in the past, but research shows that just 30 minutes of walking can reduce risk of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure. So there's kind of this benefit of building that into a commute. It's 2 birds, 1 stone. Second benefit of active transportation that I wanted to highlight is equity. Sidewalk connections and bike lanes can be a critical asset in connecting low-income communities with employment opportunities and public transportation services. Low-income communities have the highest rates of walking and bicycling to their destination. So if your community has any gaps in its active transportation network, it disproportionately impacts those communities. I always like to refer back to this graphic provided by the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. They share this data previously highlighting connectivity issues in low-income communities specifically. As you can see, 90% of high-income communities residents had sidewalks, while unfortunately only 49% of low-income communities have that same level of access. That disparity, paired with the increased frequency of walking and biking as a primary mode of transportation, has led low-income residents to being twice as likely to be killed or injured while walking or biking. The third benefit I want to mention is the positive environmental impact. Obviously, cyclists and pedestrians produce essentially no additional pollutants. Therefore, shifting your community's commute pattern towards active transportation can reduce air and noise pollution. When you're thinking about the long term in your community, it's also important to consider what shifting the commute might relate to your land use practices. So if you can reduce, for example, the demand for parking, it might present your community with an opportunity to replace surface parking with more productive or environmentally efficient land use types. And finally, the largest category I wanted to touch on today is transit accessibility. The RTA, for many reasons, has engaged active transportation investment near transit to deliver value on the region's investment and build on the strengths of the network. We do so for 2 reasons. First, in hopes of expanding a station area's walkshed or improving the first and last mile connections. Second, to support transit-oriented development, planning, and implementation. So the first, A station area walkshed refers to the area within an accessible distance of a station. Similarly, the first and last mile refers to the distance a commuter must travel to get to their destination, either before or after their transit trip. Depending on a person's physical ability and your community's infrastructure gaps, getting to and from the station might be the most difficult part of a commuter's commute. And so the thinking here is this: if we work to expand a station area's walkshed, we'll also improve the first and last mile connections for area riders. So for example, this map on the right shows the Richton Park Metro Station. The area highlighted in darker gray represents an area within a 10-minute walk of the station. Red lines representing sidewalk gaps identified in CMAP's sidewalk inventory. So as you can see, especially towards the northeast of the station, there are opportunities where investing in active transportation sidewalks or bike lanes would expand this walkshed for the Richton Park Metro Station. And it's really important to note that considering the walkshed and the first and last mile is important when convincing someone that these investments are financially worthwhile. As we're all aware, active transportation doesn't always generate a one-for-one economic output, but neighborhoods that are walkable and have access to transit in a variety of stores and services are considered location efficient. So expanding your job accessibility with these types of connections can expand your community's location efficiencies that then go on to benefit the residents, employees, and potential employers. The second priority of RTA local planning has been to encourage transit-oriented development, planning, and implementation. TOD requires proactive and continuous investment in supporting infrastructure that creates accessible and location-efficient places. The infrastructure needs of a station area also need to consider what the station area currently looks like, but also any planned developments. So frequently we'll see TOD planning and expanding active transportation infrastructure go hand in hand. So I wanted to mention a few of the RTA program opportunities that fit those two priorities that I just mentioned. The first, the Community Planning Program has offered planning and implementation assistance since 1998. Communities frequently use this annual grant to complete a TOD plan, which can offer recommendations to improve active transportation connections. The extent to which a TOD plan considers active transportation does vary, though. So here are a few examples, a few recent examples of TOD plans completed through the RTA's Community Planning Program. The first, the Bartlett Downtown TOD plan, was adopted in 2016, and it really offered a high-level prioritization, recommendations, and overall network connectedness when considering active transportation. Whereas the Worth TOD plan, adopted in 2016, also provided very specific recommendations for pedestrian-oriented lighting improvements and driveway consolidations. It was through the community planning program and completing multiple TOD plans that the RTA recognized that communities frequently faced barriers in implementing these physical infrastructure related recommendations, and for that purpose created the Access to Transit program. The Access to Transit program provides engineering and construction funding through the RTA and CMAQ funding on a biannual cycle. The program aims to improve bicycle and pedestrian accessibility with supporting infrastructure near public transportation. In doing so, the program encourages increased system ridership, supports transit-oriented development, as previously mentioned, and assists in implementing plan recommendations. I always encourage people to visit rtams.org, that's rtams.org, to learn more about previously completed projects through the Access to Transit program. So some of you might know the Access to Transit program recently closed a call for projects. Unfortunately, the timing didn't work out to where we could promote it here, but We did just recently close the call for projects, but I always encourage people, it's never too early to begin planning for the next call. There are a few examples. These are a few examples of eligible projects that funding can be applied for through the Access to Transit program. This includes bicycle parking, new sidewalks, and ADA improvements. But in the most recent call for projects, the RTA also accepted applications for micromobility, such as bicycle and scooter share programs. Additionally, the RTA made funding available to high-need communities for Phase 1 engineering. Through the Access to Transit program, the RTA frequently heard that even completing Phase 1 engineering was a barrier for communities without the means to complete and access federally based grants. So this year we accepted applications for Phase 1 engineering. And I did want to share a few resources that I've used previously to understand these topics. The first is from the EPA, titled Infrastructure Financing Options for Transit Oriented Development. This document provides a great overview of the typical options you may have available between direct fees, debt, credit assistance, equity, value capture, and grants in order to update your station area's infrastructure to match transit-oriented development plans. It also provides a number of fairly detailed case studies from around the US as to how communities build infrastructure investment programs for transit-oriented development. The second is from the FTA. It's the Manual on Pedestrian, the EPA, the Manual on Pedestrian and Bicycle Connections to Transit. This provides a lot more detail to things to consider for when you're designing the active transportation infrastructure, things like the lighting, wayfinding, and station alignment. So with that, I did want to hand it over to Maggie. And Maggie, I think you will need to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
For some reason, I am hearing an echo when I'm speaking.
Oh.
I'm not sure why. Can you hear the echo? Oh, there, that's better. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Maggie Mullen. I'm from the Active Transportation Alliance. I'm an advocacy manager there. And Alex, if you can go to the next slide. So the Active Transportation Alliance, if you're not familiar with who we are, we're a nonprofit. We advocate for walking, biking, and public transit for the Chicagoland region. And our goal is to create healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. And next slide. And so today I wanted to speak a bit about our advocacy work for the new state funding for walking and biking that will be available this summer through the ITEP program. So I'll be speaking more in depth about what that opportunity looks like, and then talking through a little bit about how you could select a project and next steps in regards to that. So back in 2019, last year, our goal was we wanted to see $50 million in dedicated state funding for walking, biking, and trail projects in the Capitol bill. And you can go to the next slide. So the reason we made that priority is because there's a program called the Illinois Transportation Enhancement Program, ITEP. Previously, in the past, it's been funded only through federal dollars, and it's a major source of funding for both walking, biking, and trails. And we were seeing that a lot of communities throughout the state were applying for this funding, but were being rejected at a ratio of 7 to 1. So we decided that we were going to look into how could we make sure there's more funding out there available for walking and biking. So next slide. So we developed relationships with state senators and representatives. We found some champions who really cared about creating safe streets and trails throughout our state. And we hired some lobbyists in Springfield. And we also relied on advocates in this area around the state. And they made a lot of calls, emails, tweets to their senators and representatives, and over 3,000 connections. And as a result of a lot of work, you can go to the next slide, we were able to get that funding. So last summer, we $50 million from the Capitol bill was going to be dedicated to walking and biking every year from now on. And this is the first time this has happened. And then also for transit, public transit is also getting funding. And of course, this funding is dependent on the motor fuel tax, which, as we know at this time, not as many people are driving, so that that part of that funding source is reduced greatly. So we're watching this, making sure that that $50 million is still there for walking and biking. And so far, from what we've heard, this ITEP program, this $50 million is going to be available this summer. So, and you can go to the next slide. So the ITEP program, it is a combination now. Previously, it was just federal funding, and now it's a combination of federal funding plus the $50 million in state funding. And it's administered through the Illinois Department of Transportation through IDOT. And right now, we don't know the total in federal funding. It will probably be at the most 40 million. So there could be $90 million available this summer for walking, biking, and trail projects, which is a big deal. We've never had anything like that in Illinois before. So we're really hoping to get the word out about this this funding opportunity and make sure as many communities are applying to get access to this funding. So next slide. So just a few details about the program. So who can apply? So it's local entities with taxing authority. So that would be local governments, county governments, school districts, park and forest preserve districts, and transit agencies. And what types of projects are eligible? So that would be pedestrian facilities, like a site building out or replacing sidewalks, building multi-use paths, pedestrian signals, could be bicycle facilities, so a lane, a route, a trail, bike racks, and then also a rails to trails project. And projects cannot exceed $2 million, and they can't be for routine maintenance, and they also can't be solely for recreation. So that they need to be a transportation project that's bringing people to destinations. So you can go on to the next slide. So these are a few examples of past ITEP projects. So there's protected bike lanes, multi-use paths, sidewalks, the pedestrian and bicycle bridge, the 43rd Street Bridge in Chicago. That picture is an example. So there's a lot that can be built with these projects. Other ideas are you could implement a bikeway pavement marking plan for an entire community. You could connect trail gaps. You could build a signal upgrade at a pedestrian crossing. So lots of different options. So you can go to the next slide. So what is covered, and Curtis will be going more into the details of what a project delivery process looks like, but within a project, preliminary engineering, as Alex mentioned, is sometimes a big barrier for communities moving forward with a project. And for the first time ever, the ITEP funding will cover phase 1 engineering, and that would be design and environmental studies that can help determine the overall approach for a project. So that's super exciting because we know that this is a big barrier. So phase 1 engineering is finally included in ITEP funding, and then phase 2 engineering as well. And the preliminary engineering, it's a 80-20 match. So that what that means is the the ITEP grant covers 80% of the costs, and then there is a 20% local match. So whoever is sponsoring the project, whether that's a local municipality, a county government, they are responsible for covering the 20% match. And I'll be talking a little bit more in detail about that in a moment. But utility relocations, construction engineering, and construction also have an 80-20 match. And then buying land, so right-of-way purchase and easement purchases, there's a 50-50 match. So next slide. So with the local match, 25% of that 50 million in state funding is now being set aside for high need communities, and that was this was a big advocacy priority for us, because what happens is just a lot of these communities that really need this infrastructure aren't able to compete with other communities. So 25% now is dedicated to high need communities, and IDOT is it's going to be based on a formula from IDOT, but it's going to involve median income and property tax rates. And then the local match is actually a sliding scale. So not every community will have to pay the 20% local match. Higher need communities could either have to pay 0% local match, so it's completely funded, or a 10% local match. And that, again, will be IDOT's calculation they'll be looking at community size, property tax base, percent below poverty level, and median income. So next slide. And just a few things to think about for selecting a project. So the project has to be in a existing plan. So look to your local and regional plans to identify potential projects. So that could be a bicycle pedestrian plan from your community. It could be a comprehensive plan. It could be the TOD plan that Alex was talking about, a safe routes to school plan, a downtown development plan, a park plan, and then also looking at your county and MPO, so CMAP plans, the long range transportation plans to identify projects. Look to see, has your community previously applied for an ITEP grant, because that could be a potential project to consider, but also you would need to look into the application to make sure was it a good application, and maybe tweak it as needed. And then think through, are there any high need areas in your community that need and want a walking, biking, or trail project, because those projects will score higher. And then shovel ready projects are generally more likely, or they will also score more favorably. So asking yourself, has phase one engineering been completed on any project? And this is perhaps an opportunity to complement RTA's Access to Transit grant, which also covers phase one engineering for high need communities. So potentially you could get phase one engineering covered through RTA, and then you would score even higher for the ITEP grant application process. And then also right of ways. So if land has been secured for a project, those projects also score higher. But of course, ITEP does cover these different phase one and right of way acquisitions. So, but just things to consider for getting a higher scoring project. So next slide. So IDOT is expected to release their call for projects this summer, maybe in the fall. And we want to try to spread the word about this. So if you know of any municipal staff, county staff, make sure to encourage them to consider applying to this funding. And there's things they can start doing now to get ready for the application. And we're actually going to be hosting a 3-part webinar series with the Illinois Public Health Institute to really dig into the entire application and make sure communities are prepared to apply once the call for projects opens, and make sure they're giving them tips to put together a strong application. So you're very welcome to email me, Maggie@activetrans.org, if you want more details about the webinar series or have any other questions about the funding opportunity or advocacy in general. So That is it from me, so I'll pass it over to Curtis.
Great. Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, Alex. Quick mic check. How is my levels here? Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Curtis Wittick. I'm a senior project manager with Antero Group, and today I'd like to present on some of the challenges and opportunities that municipal entities might face as they move forward with implementing an active transportation project. This information should hopefully be valuable to other nonprofit partners, but it's really geared towards municipalities that are looking to move forward, whether that's from the conceptual planning phase to phase 1 engineering or phase 1 to phase 2. Thank you, Michael. Sorry, Alex. So yeah, let's go ahead and go to the outline here. So I'll give a quick introduction to Antero Group and how we've been working with communities. And then we'll look at a few different approaches to project delivery. And then we'll walk through phase by phase some of the challenges and opportunities associated with each phase. And then I'll give a sneak peek of something I'm going to dive into in more detail on the third part of this Transportation Tuesdays webinar series, which is this Bedford Park Last Mile Mobility Project. And then I'll close out with some useful resources. Next slide. We can skip over that, just give my introduction. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we could skip Antero Group too. Okay, so by way of a quick place to start, let's think for a moment about an ideal project delivery process. In an ideal world, you as a municipality, let's say you have a comprehensive plan and you recently completed a capital improvement plan, and through that planning effort, you identified a specific priority project. Let's say that's an access to transit type project where you want to expand sidewalks and bike lanes that make it easier for your residents to get to your metro station in town. So walking through the process here, you've done your feasibility study, you've identified this as a priority, you've identified a general layout, and now you've secured funding, whether that's internally or through an external funding source to do phase 1. And that has gone perfectly. And now you're moving to phase 2, phase 3 engineering, and ultimately construction. And all along the way, your constituents and your board are very happy with you as a municipal planner, and everyone's cheering you along. And then your board is very happy to cut the ribbon and have a well-designed, beautiful plan or beautiful project. In reality, the process that you might go through probably won't be as smooth as this. If you go to the next slide, a typical project delivery process might look a little something more like this, where let's say there was an idea that you kind of remember from 5, 8, 10 years ago for a bike lane or a new sidewalk, and you kind of dust off that plan, and then you say, well, there's some funding available, maybe we'll apply for a grant to try and get this, and you try to cobble together the internal support you need for that critical phase 1 engineering phase, and then you get phase 2 engineering down the line, and it's not as clean and perfect as that ideal project delivery phase. And by the time you get through it and really muddle through this process, you finish the project and you kind of don't want to think about it ever again, which is a problem because maintenance is a critical issue, and we need to take that very seriously as well. So this is maybe a little harsh, but I think a actual in real life project delivery process might look a little more like this than the last slide. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a diagram that I put together as a planner who is often called to assist clients in moving through different phases of project delivery. I kind of wanted to understand for myself the different aspects of the whole life cycle of delivering a project, really from the initial idea or spark or just kernel of an idea all the way through construction and then ultimately operations and maintenance. So this is trying to thread the needle of not giving too much information, but being digestible enough. And this is adapted from similar diagrams that you might see if you look up a typical design build process with a few tweaks. So this is the project delivery process that Antero Group uses when we're working with the community to advance a infrastructure project, or really any capital project. Now that could be a water main, it could be a green infrastructure, rain garden, or green streets project, or like what we're talking about today, an active transportation project like new bike lanes or sidewalks or other improvements like that. So at a high level, there are three main phases. There's the pre-development phase, development, which is sometimes referred to as the design build phase, and the post-development phase. So within the pre-development phase, generally you want to start with some kind of capital improvement plan or list of projects that your municipality would like to prioritize and implement when the time is right and when resources are available. So within that CIP, or perhaps as a separate study or effort after that's been completed, you might do a feasibility study or a concept plan for a specific project. And then as part of that, you'll develop some preliminary cost estimates. Now those are planning level. It's a pretty high level of detail. You don't need to get into the specific quantities yet, because you won't have those yet until you get into the phase one engineering or preliminary engineering phase. Now, also with the pre-development phase, ideally you have acquired all the right-of-way you need, or you already have that. So acquisitions occurs in this part of the process. It just makes it a lot easier to design a project and deliver it moving forward. In some cases, acquisition can come later, or you could work around certain utility constraints, but ideally you have land control before you implement or move to the phase one phase, or the next phase. So within the development phase, we kind of show preliminary engineering and then develop a more detailed engineering cost estimates, permits, and design or final engineering. We show this kind of as a cycle, just because you should think of the end goal, and sometimes this is an iterative process. For example, in order to qualify for a categorical exclusion letter or other design exemptions, which are specific IDOT steps, you might design the project in a way to make the project more streamlined or feasible. So it's important to think through the different phases of project delivery. I'll walk through this in a little more detail, but essentially during the design phase, you're going to a increasing level of detail and refinement of what you want to do, and coordinating with the necessary agencies, whether that's IDOT, or if you're in the Chicago, most of us are in the Chicago region, so the MWRD or the Illinois Commerce Commission. So agency coordination and approvals are integrated within this phase. And then moving forward, you have the construction engineering and construction phase. And then I always like to keep on this idea of operations and maintenance, because if you create a bike lane, you should maintain it, and the pavement markings can fade, and then if you don't maintain it, it won't be a resource, and it won't serve its purpose very long. And then I like to include the plan update process here to see how that infrastructure is performing, how it impacts travel patterns, and incorporate that understanding into future iterations of your CIP. So that's kind of the high level overview of an integrated project delivery process. And it's integrated because you're kind of thinking about planning considerations and engineering considerations at the same time. Okay, moving forward. So on this slide, I just kind of simplify the process to use the categories that you might see if you're trying to advance an active transportation project and navigate IDOT's approval process. So you typically start with the feasibility study, and you've acquired the land and you have an idea about what you want to do. And then you have a kickoff meeting with your planning liaison, generally with through your council of governments, for example, like the South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association, or whichever part of the region you're in. So you have that kickoff meeting with your planning liaison and the appropriate contacts at IDOT, and that kind of kickstarts your phase 1 engineering phase. Then you proceed, once you have the phase 1 approvals or categorical exclusion letter, or whichever variation on that theme, you can move to phase 2. Then phase 3, which is construction engineering, bid and execute the project, and then close it out and maintain it. So I'm going to walk through a few challenges and opportunities associated with each phase here. Okay, next slide. So let's just look at the feasibility stage. Oftentimes, kind of the blank piece of paper in front of you is the hardest step, is to figure out what to do or what could be possible here. If you've had a commercial corridor or a road in your town and it's just been that way for many years or decades, it's sometimes hard to envision what that road or that streetscape could look like in the future. And this is when it's really helpful to bring in an outside pair of eyes that can help expand your vision and help you and your partners and your stakeholders envision what a corridor or a streetscape could be. Just recently, I went back to my hometown in the northwest suburbs, and I saw a new train station, all these new downtown upgrades, and even as a planner and a designer, I was still surprised by, like, wow, I didn't imagine that this town could look like this, and I was pleasantly surprised. So it's just human nature that sometimes we just get have fixed vision, and sometimes we need to zoom out and look to the future. So another challenge with this phase is planning and prioritizing projects. My recommendation there is to the extent feasible, adopt as clear and transparent of a process as possible, and to let your different stakeholders, whether that's your board of trustees or your residents, know how you determine that specific project is a priority. And that will help mitigate potential community pushback or even board pushback in the future. If you say, well, this was in the CIP, the capital improvement plan, and it ranked like this, and we selected this project based on these criteria. Also, land control. In the feasibility phase, sometimes you might not have the land control that you need to implement a project. So finding the money and getting control of that land can be a challenge. So an opportunity there could be strategic acquisitions to make sure you acquire the land that you'll need to do a project. Another way is to be creative about alignments and the actual project scope. So going back to that example of a town looking to do a bike and pedestrian improvements to the train station, let's say there's a lot of utility constraints in the right-of-way or backup curb. So instead, and this is a real case, so instead of trying to relocate all these overhead utilities and buffalo boxes and trees, we bumped the sidewalk back of curb by about 10 feet onto village-owned property, which both created kind of a natural buffer zone, as well as avoided all the utility concerns. So there's kind of creative ways that you can align your project. All right, let's move forward. And I'll try to quicken the pace here a little bit. So in the phase 1 engineering phase, funding and capacity gaps can be a major challenge. Really, you could say funding is a challenge at every step along the way, and that's true, but I want to highlight it here that in the past, there has generally been more funds available, or it's been easier for communities to access funding and technical assistance for the planning phase, and then also for the phase 2 and the implementation phases. But there's been this critical gap, and Alex and Maggie talked about it, mentioned it earlier, and that's been this phase 1 engineering phase. And if you're a high needs or low capacity community, this could be a very difficult barrier to overcome, because phase one engineering, those costs can be significant. And a lot of design decisions are made during this phase. So I'd really like to give kudos to the RTA for opening up their funding to cover the phase one engineering phase, and Cook County through Invest in Cook. That is a great funding source that communities can go to implement or to complete the phase one engineering phase. So there's ways to secure funding for this. Generally, if you're a more well-off community, you could do that internally, but a lot of communities just don't have the funds or expertise to do a phase one engineering project, so they need to either secure external consultants to help and the funding to do that. Also at this step, it's not so much a challenge, just a thing you need to do, which is to coordinate with the various agencies. And my recommendation there is to host periodic coordination meetings and take good notes, and just clear communication will help move the process forward smoothly. And it definitely gets more complicated as you add in more and more partners. In some projects, many projects, you'll have to coordinate with IDOT, the MWRD, and the ICC if there's a rail crossing, but just clear communication and good notes can go a long way. And then incorporating bike and ped facilities. If you're on this webinar, I'm assuming you're interested in doing a bike ped project, so this probably isn't an issue, but make sure you incorporate the bike ped facilities and what you want to do as early on in the process. So that's probably in the feasibility study and you're moving forward with a bike ped project, but it's difficult to add in any new items to the scope down the line. Now there's possibly ways that you could add pavement markings in phase two, but as you move forward, it becomes harder to incorporate new elements to the project. Okay, next slide. Phase two. Here, the main thing I really want to highlight is it takes time. It just takes time to design and get the approvals you need from the different agencies. So it's important to be conservative in your scheduling and plan accordingly, and give each phase enough time to complete it, and also allow for unknown things to come up and potentially push back timelines. And this is especially important if you have federal or state funding that is locked into specific timelines, because you don't want to say you're going to complete something in 1 year or 2 years and then fall behind and then risk having to pay back those dollars or move back in the queue or lose the opportunity to those dollars. So just recognize that it takes time to plan and design and implement a transportation project and be conservative. Again, I keep this in there because it's so important. Agency coordination and approvals, and just having those periodic meetings, bringing all the necessary stakeholders together and keeping everyone informed and having clear communications protocols. And then lastly, known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So things are going to come up as you move forward in the design process, and new information is going to come to light. So it's really important to either have the skills in-house or engage a consultant or whomever, partners with experience who've seen the different issues that can come up and derail a project and can anticipate those and then help you work around those challenges when they do arise, because they will. So creative problem solving is a really important skill to have as you're moving forward in the project delivery process. Okay, next slide. I'm just going to go through this really quick. Here, some of the typical challenges could be, procurement and aligning the procurement timeline up with the letting schedules. If and navigating your community's QBS process, or qualification-based selection process, which is a requirement for any federal dollars. Traffic management, of course, is its own unique challenge. As a planner, though, it also is an opportunity to observe how traffic patterns change during a construction project. So use that disruption to see if people shift to different modes of travel, or if they take a different route. And maybe you'll learn that adding a new lane of traffic, or a new travel lane, or widening the road isn't really necessary. So use the construction process as an opportunity to learn how people are getting around in your community. And then, of course, public communication. No one wants to be blindsided, or all of a sudden have the road torn up in front of them, or a major project happening and have no notice of that. Now, granted, it's difficult to give perfect information to everyone, but do your best to communicate through all available channels that you have to make sure that your constituents and other stakeholders are aware of what's going to happen. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, but certainly not least, the post-development phase. So operations and maintenance. The challenge is, and the reality is, it's not a priority for most people and for most municipalities. So the opportunity is to build O&M into your initial scope and really into your whole life cycle of the project, and prioritize good operations and maintenance practices, and just anticipate that you're going to have to repair your project in maybe a few months, or make certain steps after it's been built. For example, in a green infrastructure project, if you're installing, let's say, a rain garden to reduce flooding, you know that you're going to have to weed very aggressively in the first year to make sure that that project sticks and thrives in the long term. So oftentimes the first few months or years after a project's built is an important time to really have good O&M practices. Monitoring is costly. So with regards to monitoring, I'm talking about observing that project and how people respond to it. Avoid this set it and forget it mentality where you just kind of build it and leave it, because again, you have an opportunity to see how this project impacts your community. And as a municipal planner or a trustee member, like, your community is never done. It's never complete. It's always on this process, hopefully, of continually improving. So always be thinking about how your project can be improved upon in the future. For example, let's say you build sharrows on a neighborhood street that connects to your metro station, and you see people are using those, and you've seen bike ridership increase, when that's a great outcome of your project. But maybe in the next phase, you want to do a buffered bike lane or a protected bike lane and continue to encourage that behavior shift. So always be thinking about how you can use your project as a springboard for future projects or future improvements. And okay, next slide. That's just kind of a recap of the whole cycle. And here, really quick, this is kind of a sneak peek. I'm going to show a few before and after renderings taken from a recent project that we did in the village of Bedford Park, because you can kind of see some of the integrated thinking here. Also, these are just conceptual renderings, so we're very much at that early pre-development phase. We haven't gone to phase 1 engineering on any of these, but you could see the concepts. So here you could, maybe this looks similar to something in your community where you have a curb cut that leads to nowhere. And there's an obvious desire line as shown by the dirt, and you see that people want to go there, and you can see the sidewalk continues after this intersection. So there's an opportunity to build a sidewalk where people want to go, include a buffer zone and a ladder style pedestrian crosswalk, and some new pavement markings. Next slide. Here is overpass over a rail yard, and here the opportunity is to just bring your pedestrian infrastructure up to a state of good repair by removing the vegetation and the weeds that are coming through the cracks. And on the left, maybe you replace some of those invasive species with native plants that create a nicer pedestrian environment. There's some other shared mobility, that shuttle van there, but I will discuss that later at a future webinar. Next slide. Here is obviously a high traffic corridor, high truck traffic corridor. This is actually 71st Street in Bedford Park. Here you can see a pretty wide right-of-way with the sidewalk right at back of curb. So what if we switch this around, add a buffer zone and some kind of shared use cycle track or side path off of the road, and use that right of way a little more effectively to create a multimodal corridor. And hopefully, if you did this, you would potentially reduce traffic, because people would have a different means by which to go east and west along this corridor. Okay, next slide. Actually, let's just skip to the end, because we're pretty close to the hour. I just want to say that we do have some resources. We are in the process of rolling out a technical assistance, kind of a grant program for ourselves to help specifically very resource constrained communities get to that phase 1 process or develop some cost estimates. So feel free to reach out. We also have compiled some resources related to COVID-19. And I'm happy to follow up with an email or phone call with people after this if they would like to see any of those resources. And that's it. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Oh. I'm getting that feedback loop. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so we do have a few questions. First, Sarah is curious of any feedback from deaf, blind, or partially sighted residents as to their experience interacting with specifically bike infrastructure. Maggie or Curtis, could either of you speak to resources as to how to receive such feedback from residents, and if there are any resources that should be consulted when designing infrastructure to avoid those pressure points or conflicts?
Okay, so I'll respond to this kind of at a high level, which is, to the extent that you can, you want to get as much input into your planning and design process from different stakeholders and different users. Admittedly, the blind community has been difficult to reach out to, as are other people. So I think it's the responsibility of the planners to really make that effort and reach out to different groups that have historically been not engaged in these processes. So unfortunately, I don't have really good specific ideas, and I would be welcome to hearing more ideas about how to better reach out to people who are blind, and would very much like to incorporate that into my practice. In terms of specific design considerations, I have learned that let's think about ADA infrastructure, kind of the curb cuts with the tactile pads. In some cases, you might have seen those are pretty common when they're aligned with a pedestrian crosswalk. But some places you'll see a whole corner of an intersection have a tactile pad, and I've heard that the smaller tactile pads that really align with the crosswalk are preferred over the broader or the wider tactile pads, because someone who's visually impaired can't feel exactly where to cross. So that's one anecdote that I've picked up, but of course there's more information, and I'd be welcome to learn more about how to engage that community.
Perfect.
One quick thing is Access Living is potentially a good resource. They're an advocacy and social change organization. They advocate for all kinds of people who have disabilities. So I personally, I think, yeah, reaching out to them. I can ask our planner at Active Trans if she has any resources in particular, and we can get back to Sarah if she's looking for particular resources.
Okay, perfect. And then we also had a question about the ITAP funding. When we're referring to a $2 million project cap, is that referring to the project overall, or is that just the cap on ITAP request?
That's the cap on the ITAP funding.
Perfect. And then also when we're talking about ITAP, what strategies will be put into place to market the program and funding availability to high-need communities? I know, Maggie, that you mentioned that Active Trans is hosting 4 different webinars. Would you want to speak more to that and those resources?
Yeah. So we're going to be hosting webinars starting in June, and we're trying to get the word out. Like, we have a network of communities that we'll be sharing the information with. We're trying to get more people to help spread the word. So we'll try to get that shared far and wide. And then we are doing a learning collaborative with 15 communities. That there was an application a while ago when we were focused on finding communities that were higher need to help provide more one-on-one guidance and technical assistance to apply for the ITAP funding.
Okay, perfect. I think that's it. I'm not seeing any other questions. Todd did share in the chat that regarding outreach to the blind, some visit libraries for resources, so contacting local library branches for engagement methods might be worth exploring, which is a great piece of advice. I agree. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions. Thanks everyone for joining us. Like I mentioned, this is the first of 4, so we have 3 more. We do skip the week of Labor Day, so please, there are 2 in June, but please come back. The registration is still open for those, and let us know if you have any other questions. We'll be providing Curtis and Maggie's contact information when we post the recording of this, so you'll be able to reach out to them there. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.